Imagine a figure so colossal, so central to cultural history, that he's basically the sun around which an entire century of intellectual life revolved.
That's a great way to put it.
We're talking about someone who wasn't just a writer. I mean, sure, he wrote the book that arguably created the concept of the modern bestseller, and he wrote the drama that defines a whole nation. But if you stop there, you are missing like 80% of the picture.
It really is a classic tip of the iceberg case, isn't it? Because usually when we think of these literary giants, we think of them, locked away in a room with a quill and ink, sort of isolated from the world.
Right.
We don't picture them dissecting elephant skulls or managing the reopening of silver mines or commanding troops during an invasion.
Exactly. And that is the journey we're going on today. We are looking at a man who was so impressive that when Napoleon, and this is Napoleon at the height of his power, the master of Europe, when Napoleon met him, he was completely starstruck.
Utterly. He just looked at him and said, "Vous êtes un homme."
Which means you are a man.
Yeah. But coming from Napoleon, that was the ultimate compliment. It wasn't just, "you're a man." It was, "you are a complete human being." The full package.
Today on The Deep Dive, we're tackling the life, the science. Yes, the science and the chaotic loves of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And we've got a massive stack of notes here. We're pulling from biographical records, historical accounts of his interactions with people like Beethoven and Napoleon, and deep summaries of his scientific work.
Things like his theory of colors and metamorphosis of plants.
And our mission here is really to understand how one person can effectively embody an entire cultural shift. The transition from the age of reason to romanticism. He's often called the German Shakespeare, but I think by the end you'll see that label is almost too limiting.
Oh, absolutely. He was a polymath in the truest, most complete sense of the word.
A polymath who also happened to be a bit of a rock star in his 20s. So let's unpack this. We've got a roadmap for the discussion. We're going to start with his early years and the absolute scandal that was the Sorrows of Young Werther.
The book that made him famous overnight.
Then we're going to pivot to the part that surprises most people. His career as a statesman and, kind of bizarrely, a scientist.
Which is where things get really fascinating because he actually claimed he was more proud of his color theory than all of his poetry combined.
Which sounds completely insane, but we will get to why he thought that. Then we'll look at his time in Italy, his legendary friendship with Schiller, and the wild personal life involving his mistress-turned-wife and some very rude French soldiers.
The Spoon Guards, a great story.
And finally, we'll wrap up with his legacy, his masterpiece Faust, and the myths surrounding his death.
It is a lot of ground to cover, but every piece connects. It forms a picture of a man who just refused to be categorized.
So let's jump in at the beginning. Frankfurt, 1749, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is born into what we would call a pretty comfortable setup.
Very comfortable. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, was an imperial counselor. He'd inherited a huge fortune, lived in a large house, but he was also a man with some thwarted ambitions. He hadn't quite achieved the public status he wanted.
Ah, I know this dynamic.
So he poured all of that energy into his children, especially his son.
The classic, I didn't make it so you will thing.
Precisely. And the education young Goethe received was, well, it was intense. He had private tutors for everything. We're not just talking about one or two languages. We're talking Latin, Greek, French, Italian, English, and even biblical Hebrew.
Just a casual 6 languages before you're an adult. No big deal.
And it wasn't just book learning. He took lessons in dancing, writing, and fencing. His father was meticulously building a gentleman.
A perfect product of the Enlightenment.
But there's this interesting little detail about his family tree that often gets overlooked. On his mother's side, the text mentions he descended from the Soldan family.
Oh, I saw this in the notes. This is the Oriental ancestor theory.
Right. There have been these claims, or family legends, that his maternal grandmother's lineage goes back to a Turkish officer, a man named Sadık Salih Zoltan.
And the story goes he was captured during the Crusades.
Sometime in that era, yes. Captured, brought to Germany, baptized, and eventually integrated into the nobility.
So the great prince of German poets might have had roots reaching back to the Middle East. That's fascinating.
It's a really compelling possibility, and it maybe shed some light on why, later in life, Goethe showed such a profound interest in the East and in Islam, which we'll definitely touch on.
But as a kid, his imagination was fired up by something much closer to home. Puppet shows.
The French occupation, right.
Yes. During the 7 Years' War, French soldiers actually occupied Frankfurt and were billeted in the Goethe family home.
Right, in his house.
And they put on these puppet shows, and young Johann was just mesmerized. It seems trivial, but this obsession with theater, with the mechanics of storytelling, it seems to have started right there.
And it clearly stuck with him because that whole puppet theater theme shows up years later in his huge novel, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship.
But despite this obvious artistic spark, his dad says, no, you're going to be a lawyer.
Of course.
Yeah.
So off he goes to Leipzig University in 1765, and he absolutely hated it.
He detested memorizing the rules. I feel like that's a pretty common theme with geniuses. They hate the rote memorization part of education.
He couldn't stand it. He preferred attending poetry lectures, but even then he was critical. He fell in love. He wrote some cheerful Rococo-style verses, but he was basically just avoiding his actual studies.
And then he gets sick. And this isn't just a bad cold. The sources describe a major health crisis, a hemorrhage.
A very serious one. He has to move back home to Frankfurt, and he spends about a year and a half just recovering.
And this seems like a real turning point.
A huge one. He's stuck in bed being nursed by his mother and his sister Cornelia, who he was very close to, and he just reads. He dives into alchemy, religion, mysticism. It's this intensely introspective period that really deepens his thinking.
So when he finally recovers and goes to Strasbourg to finish his law degree, he's a different person.
He is, and that's where he meets Johann Gottfried Herder.
Which is a crucial meeting.
Absolutely crucial. Herder is the one who really introduces him to Shakespeare. And you have to understand, at this time in Germany, French culture was the gold standard. It was the dominant high-status model. Herder and Goethe started looking at Shakespeare and at German folk poetry, Volkspoesie, as something more authentic, more raw and powerful.
And this is the birth of the Sturm und Drang movement.
Storm and stress.
It sounds like a teenage emo band, but it was a serious literary movement.
It was. It was a full-blown reaction against the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment. It was all about high emotion, individualism, breaking the rules, subjectivity, and Goethe, almost overnight, becomes the poster child for it.
And nothing screams high emotion like the book that made him a superstar, The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Published in 1774. He was only 24 years old.
Okay, for anyone listening who hasn't read it, give us the quick rundown. What is Werther all about?
It's an epistolary novel, which means it's written as a series of letters. The protagonist, Werther, is this very sensitive, very artistic young man who falls desperately in love with a woman named Lotte.
The problem is,
Lotte is already engaged to a very decent, very steady, but kind of boring guy named Albert.
of course,
And Werther just can't handle the intensity of his unrequited feelings. He spirals into this deep depression, and eventually he commits suicide by shooting himself.
it sounds incredibly dark, but the source material is clear on this.
Yeah.
This was arguably the world's first bestseller. It wasn't just popular, it was a phenomenon.
It was a contagion, and what makes it so potent is that it was deeply semi-autobiographical.
This was based on his own life.
Very much so. Goethe really did fall for a woman named Charlotte Buff, who was engaged to another man, Johann Christian Kessner. And around that same time, a friend of Goethe's, a young man named Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, actually did kill himself over an unrequited love.
So Goethe takes his own feelings, his own heartbreak, mixes them with his friend's very real tragedy, and pours it all into this book. He famously said he shot his hero to save himself.
Exactly. For him, writing it was cathartic. He purged those suicidal feelings onto the page. But for the rest of Europe, it had the opposite effect. This became known as the Werther effect.
People started dressing like him, right? The Werther costume.
Yes. All across Europe, young men started wearing a blue tailcoat with a yellow vest and trousers. It became the uniform of the suffering romantic soul.
But it got darker than just a fashion trend.
Oh, much darker. There was a documented spike in copycat suicides. People were found dead with copies of the book in their pockets. It was so controversial that it was banned in several places, like Leipzig and Denmark.
I mean, that is wild. A book having that kind of direct physical impact on society, it was seen as glorifying suicide.
It was. The novel ends with a funeral that no clergyman attended, which was just shocking for the time. It challenged the religious and social order. And it made Goethe, at age 24, instantly one of the most famous men in Europe.
Napoleon read it 7 times.
7 times. He carried it with him on his campaign in Egypt. But here's the kicker. Goethe made almost no money from it.
Because copyright laws were basically non-existent.
Right. There were pirated editions everywhere. He had all the fame, but almost none of the fortune. But that fame was enough to get him an invitation that would change his life forever.
Enter the Duke.
Duke Karl August of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. He was just 18 years old, a young, enlightened ruler, and he invited the famous author of Werther to his court in Weimar in 1775.
And Goethe basically never leaves. He stays there for the rest of his life. But this is where the story pivots from tortured artist to something completely different. You'd expect him to just sit around writing poems for the Duke, but he gets a job. A real job.
Several jobs, actually. This is the statesman phase, and it's kind of baffling. Goethe wasn't just a court decoration. He was made a member of the Duke's Privy Council. He was put in charge of the War Commission. He was tasked with reopening the silver mines in Ilmenau. He was even in charge of road building.
Wait, road building? The guy who wrote the most emotional, heart-wrenching novel of the century is now deciding where the pavement goes.
And taking it very, very seriously. For a few years, he was effectively the prime minister and the chancellor of the exchequer. He was running the day-to-day administration of the entire duchy. Budgets, infrastructure, military affairs. He was in the thick of it.
That's just a completely different skill set.
It is, but there is a darker side to this administrative work, isn't there? The notes mention something about mercenaries.
Yes, and this is a controversial point raised by the author Daniel Wilson. He claims that as head of the War Commission, Goethe was involved in negotiating the forced sale of vagabonds, criminals, and political dissidents to the British military.
To fight in the American Revolution.
Exactly. The British needed bodies to fight the American colonists, and many German princes were selling their subjects as mercenaries to fill that need. It was a source of income for the state.
So if this is true, it puts Goethe in a position of treating human beings as, well, as commodities, which sits very uneasily with his reputation as a great humanist.
It's a heavy contradiction, but I guess that's part of the complexity of the man. He wasn't just an observer of life. He was a full participant in the machinery of the state with all its moral compromises.
And speaking of observation, while he's running the state, he starts doing something else that baffled his contemporaries. He starts doing hard science.
And we aren't just talking about a casual hobby. He was obsessed.
He was. And this is the part of the deep dive that is just so fascinating. Goethe famously told his secretary, Eckermann, that he took no pride in his poetry. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Excellent poets have lived at the same time as me, but that in my century I am the only person who knows the truth in the difficult science of colors. Of that, I am not a little proud."
That is a massive claim. I'm the only one in the entire century who gets it. So what was his beef with the science of color?
Well, his main opponent was Isaac Newton.
So he's taking on Newton.
Yeah.
That's bold.
Very bold. Newton, as we all know, had demonstrated with his prism that white light is composed of all the colors of the spectrum. It's an analytic, mathematical view of light. Goethe hated that.
Why? What was his objection?
Goethe felt that by reducing color to numbers and angles, mathematics killed the phenomenon itself. He believed color wasn't something hidden in light, but that it arose from the dynamic interplay of light and darkness.
Light and darkness.
Yes. He said color emerges when light and dark interact through a turbid medium. So, for Goethe, yellow is what happens when you see light through a slightly darkened medium, like the atmosphere at sunrise. Blue is what happens when you see darkness through a light-filled medium, like the sky during the day.
So, scientifically, by modern physics standards.
By the standards of physics, Newton was right and Goethe was wrong. The math works, but, and this is a huge, but Goethe wasn't really doing physics. He was doing phenomenology. He was studying the physiological experience of color.
How the human eye perceives it.
Exactly. He described things like colored shadows and afterimages with incredible precision, things Newton's theory completely ignored. His work on the psychological effects of color, how red feels agitating and blue feels calming, was groundbreaking. It anticipated later theories and deeply influenced painters like J.M.W. Turner and philosophers like Wittgenstein.
So he was wrong about the physics, but right about the perception.
In a nutshell, yes. But his scientific contributions didn't stop at light. He was also a pioneer in biology.
The Goethe bone.
The intermaxillary bone. In the 18th century, a key argument for human exceptionalism was that humans lacked this specific bone in the upper jaw, the intermaxillary bone, which almost all other mammals had. It was seen as a key anatomical difference distinguishing us from animals.
A physical sign of our special status.
Right. But Goethe didn't buy it. He was a great comparative anatomist. He compared human skulls, including a fetal skull, with an elephant skull and other mammals. And in 1784, he found it.
He found the bone in humans.
He did. It's just that in humans, it fuses with the jawbone very early in development, making it hard to see. By proving we have the same bone structure, he was providing powerful evidence for what we now call homology, the idea that different species share a common anatomical blueprint.
That sounds suspiciously like a step towards evolution.
It was a huge step. He didn't have the concept of natural selection like Darwin would later, but he absolutely saw nature as fluid, dynamic, and transforming. This connects directly to his botany work. He wrote a whole treatise called The Metamorphosis of Plants.
What was the big idea there?
The big idea was alles ist Blatt.
All is leaf.
All is leaf, even the flower, yes. He argued that all the different parts of a plant, the petals, the stamens, the sepals, are just modified leaves. They're all variations on the same underlying form.
That's actually really beautiful. It's a scientific theory that sounds like a poem.
It is poetic science. He called it morphology. He was searching for the archetype, the earthlands, or the primal plant, from which all other plants could be derived. He believed if you looked closely enough, you could see the unity in all of nature's variety.
It's amazing he had time for all this while basically running a country and writing novels. But I guess the pressure eventually got to him because in 1786, he pulls a disappearing act.
The Italian journey. He had been in Weimar for 10 years, working constantly in administration. He felt he was drying up artistically. He was creatively burnt out. So without telling almost anyone, he only told the Duke, not even his close platonic companion Charlotte von Stein. He just leaves.
He ghosted.
Essentially. He slips out of town before dawn and travels to Italy under a pseudonym. He goes to Rome, Naples, and Sicily.
And he has that famous quote about Sicily. To have seen Italy without having seen Sicily is to not have seen Italy at all.
Right, because in Sicily, he saw the Greek roots of Western culture, the temples, the art. This trip completely changed him. He went from the emotional storm of Werther to what we now call Weimar Classicism. He became obsessed with classical ideals of order, balance, simplicity, and harmony.
There's a bit of a mystery about this trip, though, right? A gap in the records.
There is. His journals have a significant documented gap during his time in Venice. Historians have speculated wildly about what he was up to. Secret love affairs, maybe even some espionage for the Duke. But we just don't know for sure.
I love a good historical mystery. But eventually he has to come back to the real world, back to Weimar. And when he returns, he starts what is probably the most important friendship of his life.
Friedrich Schiller.
Now, they didn't like each other at first, did they?
Not at all. They were wary rivals. Schiller was the new hotshot of the Sturm and Drang movement, a generation younger, and Goethe had kind of moved on to his more formal classicist phase. They saw each other as opposites.
So what changed?
In 1794, they had a long conversation after a science lecture, of all things, and they realized their minds worked in perfect counterpoint. Goethe was intuitive and observational. Schiller was philosophical and abstract. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts.
It was a true collaborative friendship.
The best kind. Schiller was the one who really pushed Goethe to finish his major works. He'd say, "You have to finish Faust." They critiqued each other's work constantly, relentlessly. They practically lived in each other's pockets intellectually for a decade. It's hard to imagine Goethe's later works without Schiller's prodding.
Speaking of living arrangements, we really need to talk about Goethe's personal life back in Weimar, because while he's hanging out with Schiller and writing these high-minded classical plays, his domestic situation was scandalous for the time.
Very. He was living openly with Christian Vulpius. She wasn't from the nobility or the educated class. She worked in a flower factory when they met. They weren't married. They lived together for years and had a son.
And Weimar high society was not okay with this.
Not at all. They looked down on her. They called her his fat half behind his back and considered her an uneducated drunk. They ostracized her.
But she proves herself to be incredibly tough, which brings us to 1806.
The year is 1806. Napoleon's army has just crushed the Prussian forces at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt. They invade and occupy Weimar.
And this is where we get the story of the Spoon Guards.
Right. These were undisciplined French soldiers, part of the marauders, known as Spoon Guards, because they were looting everything they could, especially silverware. A few of them break into Goethe's house. They get into his wine cellar. They are drunk and aggressive.
And they burst into his bedroom with bayonets drawn.
Goethe was petrified. I mean, he's a 57-year-old intellectual, not a fighter. But Christiane, she physically throws herself between him and the soldiers. She argues with them, stands up to them, and organizes the servants to barricade the kitchen and cellar. She effectively saves Goethe's life.
That is a real ride-or-die partner right there.
Absolutely, and Goethe recognized it. Just days later, after 18 years of living together in sin, he takes her to a church and marries her. He legitimized their relationship, primarily, it seems, to ensure her security and legal standing after that terrifying night.
It's an incredible story. And speaking of the French invasion, this leads us to the meeting with Napoleon himself in 1808.
This was at the Congress of Erfurt. Napoleon, the emperor, summons Goethe. Now, just picture this scene. Napoleon is the most powerful man on the planet. He's conquering kingdoms. But when he meets Goethe, he's the fanboy.
Because he'd read Werther 7 times.
Yes, he apparently carried it with him on his campaigns. They talk about literature and politics, and that's when Napoleon looks him over and delivers that famous line, "Vous êtes un homme," you are a man. He even awarded Goethe the Legion of Honor.
This must have put Goethe in a really tricky spot, didn't it? Because at this time, German nationalism is really starting to bubble up. There's this intense hatred for the French occupiers.
Right, and people wanted Goethe, as the nation's greatest writer, to write patriotic, anti-French hate poetry.
And he refused.
Completely refused. He considered himself a supranationalist, a citizen of the world. He told Eckermann, "How could I write songs of hatred when I felt no hate?" He valued civilization and culture above national borders. He said you can't hate a nation like France that is among the most cultivated in the world and to which he owed so much of his own culture.
That is a very modern, very cosmopolitan perspective. But it probably did make him popular with the German nationalists at the time.
No, it certainly didn't. But Goethe was always playing the long game. And the longest game of all was Faust.
The masterpiece.
It was his life's work, literally.
Right.
He started writing the first version, the Faust, in his early 20s, around 1773. He published Part 1 in 1808, and he didn't seal the manuscript for Part 2 until 1832, just before he died. He worked on it on and off for 60 years.
Most people know the basic concept. Faust sells his soul to the devil, Mephistopheles, for knowledge and power and worldly pleasure.
But Goethe's version is much more nuanced than that. It's a wager, not a simple sale. Faust says to the devil, essentially, "If you can ever give me a moment of such pure satisfaction that I say to that moment, 'Linger a while, you are so fair,' then you can have my soul."
So it's all about the striving. As long as he keeps striving and is never fully satisfied, he's safe.
Exactly. A key line is, "Man errs as long as he strives." It became the defining drama of the Germans. It inspired everything: operas by Gounod and Berlioz, symphonies by Mahler and Liszt.
And, randomly, a very specific scientific discovery by Nikola Tesla.
This is one of my favorite connections in all of history. Tesla had memorized the entire text of Faust in the original German. He was walking through a park in Budapest, reciting the sunset speech from Faust, and suddenly, in a flash of insight, he visualized the rotating magnetic field.
No way.
Yes, that moment of reciting poetry led directly to the invention of the AC motor, which literally powers our modern world today.
That is incredible. The power of poetry literally leading to electric power.
It just shows the interconnectedness of all knowledge, which is what Goethe's whole life is about.
So, we're moving into his later years now. He's a legend, he's an institution, the Olympian of Weimar, but he's still Goethe, which means he's still falling in love.
And it gets a little uncomfortable here. In 1821, after surviving a serious heart illness, the 72-year-old Goethe falls head over heels for a young woman named Ulrich von Levetzow.
Who was? How old?
17.
Yikes, yeah. That's a 55-year age gap.
It is, and he was serious. He actually wanted to marry her. He asked the Grand Duke to act as a go-between and make the proposal on his behalf.
And your mother said, absolutely not, I assume?
Correct. Her mother politely but firmly declined. The marriage never happened. Goethe was completely crushed by the rejection.
But being Goethe,
he channeled that heartbreak directly into art. On the carriage ride home, he wrote the Marienbad Elegy, which is considered one of his finest, most personal, and most tender poems.
it's that classic tortured artist trope, again, even at 72. But he wasn't just chasing teenagers. He was also mentoring the next generation. He had a famous meeting with a young Felix Mendelssohn.
Yes, the composer. Mendelssohn was an incredible prodigy, just 12 years old at the time. Now, Goethe had a unique basis for comparison because he had actually heard the 7-year-old Mozart play decades earlier.
So he'd seen the two greatest child prodigies in music history. What did he say?
He told his music advisor, Zelter, that while Mozart's playing was miraculous, Mendelssohn's improvisation bore the same relation to Mozart's as the cultivated talk of a grown-up person bears to the prattle of a child.
Wow. He put Mendelssohn above Mozart. That is incredibly high praise.
It shows that even in his old age, he was still engaging with the new generation of genius. He wasn't stuck in the past.
Let's talk about his worldview in these later years. We talked about his possible ancestry and his interest in Islam earlier. Where did he ultimately land on religion?
It's complex. He was born Lutheran, but his contemporaries often called him the great heathen. He really distanced himself from organized Christian theology. He once called church history a hodgepodge of mistakes and violence.
But he wasn't an atheist.
No, not at all. He seems to have been more of a pantheist or a free thinker. He believed in a divine presence in nature, very much in the vein of Spinoza. But he had some very specific dislikes. In one of his Venetian epigrams, he listed the 4 things he hated most in the world.
I have the list here. It's fantastic. Number 1, tobacco smoke. 2, bed bugs. 3, garlic. And number 4, the cross.
Which is a pretty shocking thing to include on a list for a European intellectual in the 19th century. He explained that he disliked the cross as a symbol because he felt it obsessively focused on the suffering and death of Jesus rather than his life and teachings.
And he continued to look east for inspiration.
He did. He wrote the West Eastern Divan, a whole collection of poems inspired by the 14th century Persian poet Hafez. He was trying to create a dialogue between the Orient and the Occident. And even in his youth, he wrote a powerful poem called Muhammad's Gesang, or Muhammad's Song, which portrays the prophet as this elemental natural force.
It just reinforces that citizen of the world vibe he cultivated.
He really was. He saw value in all great cultures.
So we come to the end, March 22nd, 1832. Goethe dies of heart failure in Weimar. He's buried in the ducal vault right next to Schiller.
Yeah.
And we have to address the famous last words.
Mehr Licht.
More light. It's just perfect, right? The great thinker of the Enlightenment asking for more illumination as he fades into the dark.
It's perfect symbolism, a perfect end to the story, but the reality is probably a little more mundane.
Okay, ruin it for us. What really happened?
Well, for one, the doctor who reported it, Carl Vogel, wasn't actually in the room when he died. Other accounts suggest he was just uncomfortable in the dim room. He might have actually said, "Open the second shutter so that more light comes in."
So he literally just wanted someone to open the window.
Probably. The historian Thomas Carlyle's version is even more blunt. Open the shutters so I can get more light. But in the end, does it really matter? The myth captured the essential truth of his life's work.
That's a great point.
He was a man who spent his entire life fighting against darkness and obscurity. He spent his life trying to shed light on everything, from the bones in our face to the colors of the rainbow to the deepest corners of the human soul.
So his legacy is undeniable. Ralph Waldo Emerson listed him as one of just 6 representative men of all humanity, right up there with Plato and Shakespeare.
And today we have the Goethe Institute promoting German culture all over the world. His influence runs through Hegel, through Jung, through whole schools of philosophy and science. He really does bridge the gap. He's the link between the age of reason and the age of romanticism.
So, after all of this, what does it all mean for us? What's the final thought here?
I think the most provocative takeaway from Goethe comes from a line in Faust. Action is the beginning of everything. Goethe didn't just think, he did.
He didn't stay in his lane.
Exactly. We live in an age of hyper-specialization. You're a coder, or you're a writer, or you're a financial analyst. Goethe would have rejected that completely. He was a poet who needed to understand granite. He was a lover who needed to understand tax administration. He believed it was all connected.
So here's the question for you, the listener. If the man who wrote the greatest drama in the German language also spent months staring at rock samples and elephant skulls just to find the truth, what connections are we missing in our own lives by categorizing things too strictly?
What could you discover if you just stepped out of your designated lane?
Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us on Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.